Is it safe to round your spine? Is it safe to do crunches, to do a passive standing forward fold? Is it okay to flex your spine? Or are the shear forces destructive to the spine, and will they cause you pain and degeneration in the future? Let's check it out. Real quick, my name is Anthony Davis. This is Shapeshift Wellness. We explore the science of fitness, yoga, and meditation. If you like that sort of thing, subscribe to my channel. And you can always check out educational courses on my website, shapeshiftwellness.com. So check the links in the description. Now, let's learn about low back pain and see if it's going to be more likely if you do sit-ups and round your spine that you're going to have a bad time. Let's check it out. First, I want to make it very clear that in this video, I have just selected some highlights through the current existing literature on rounding spine, spinal flexion, and back pain and back problems, so that you can see that there is a fair amount of literature showing that it probably is not a big deal to round the spine. And in fact, it might actually be not just neutral, but good. It might actually be good to do some spinal flexion for the health of the intervertebral discs. So this is not going to be talking about the other side of the debate. So there is a whole other side of the debate, and I could pull up articles to that effect. So I'm not talking about that. I don't want you to get the wrong idea that this is all the literature out there and that there's no good argument in favor of being hesitant about spinal flexion. There are some things that can happen in spinal flexion that for some people we would not want to happen. And so we would maybe coach them on how to, lift with the neutral spine and how to hip hinge and that kind of stuff. And that would be especially prevalent if you've read Dr. Stu McGill's work. That would have come up. So now let's explore. So the opposite of that would be saying, it's okay to round your spine. Let's check it out. So this first article that I've got pulled up here basically says that in order to hydrate the discs, so you've got all these discs between each vertebral level, and those discs need nutrients. And the only way, because they don't have a blood supply, the only way that they can get nutrients is through movement. So flexion and extension will help to literally hydrate the disc and make for a healthier disc. And maybe that actually, by exploring both flexion and extension in the spine, you might actually end up with a better hydrated disc, and maybe that means less degeneration over time, but I'd have to pull up research on that, so don't quote me on that. But this is, it's logical to assume that a better hydrated disc is a healthier disc. So that would be saying, hey, maybe flexion actually is important for spinal health. This is an old study, and they were looking at populations who had adapted to a squatting position and actually gotten used to a flexed spine or a rounded spine, and they found less degeneration. So they were curious if this might mean that perhaps adapting to a flexed posture actually prevents degenerative disc disease. So maybe flexed postures could be beneficial even in a certain context. This study, now it's interesting in the clinical world where we talk, there are several methodologies of helping people with low back pain, and some of the popular ones, there are two sort of competing thoughts of sometimes we do things like flexion distraction, where we flex the spine intentionally to hydrate the discs and help to heal the discs. But then there's, like McKenzie protocols that are more extension based, or they tend to be more extension based, although not always. And so there are competing schools of thought. One of them, they're both trying to achieve the same goal, which is to help people who have low back pain and to help heal their spines and to help desensitize their spines and get them out of back pain. But on one hand, you've got people who are doing it by encouraging spinal extension and saying, let's avoid flexion. And then the other camp saying the opposite. They're saying, no, let's do extension, or let's do flexion, and let's, not necessarily do the extension. But this study showed that both groups essentially have the same results, whether you do flexion or extension for people. Maybe it's just the mobility. Maybe it's just by virtue of moving the spine. It's not necessarily, we got to only do extension or we only got to do flexion. Maybe by virtue of simply keeping the spine moving, that can help people with low back pain. Now, of course, yoga teachers and personal trainers should not be dealing with or managing pain, but maybe in prehab, in other words, in just maintaining good health of the spine for people who are out of pain, who are safe to exercise and all of that. Not that it's unsafe to exercise with pain, but again, yoga teachers shouldn't be managing that. So for the purpose of general health recommendations and general movement recommendations, we can say, well, maybe just by virtue of moving your spine in all directions that it is capable of moving on a regular basis, we have a good, healthy, mobile, hydrated spine. A recent study in 2020 looked at lifting technique in people who have pain in their low back versus people who do not have pain. And you would expect that the people who tend to have pain, well, they probably have pain because they're lifting with crappy posture, right? They're probably lifting with crappy posture with a rounded back. They're lifting with their back, not their legs, and therefore they have low back pain. But weirdly, this systematic review looked at a bunch of studies and they tried to compare lifting technique with painful people who have pain and people who don't have pain, and they found that the people who have pain actually tend to lift with better posture. The people who tend to have chronic pain tend to have actually better posture, textbook better posture than the people who don't. So maybe a healthy spine is a spine that can move through its full range of motion rather than a rigid spine that is locked in a single position. So again, this is pointing to the idea that maybe static posture is not good or bad, but the ability to move through your full range of motion and be strong in that full range of motion, maybe that's what indicates a good, healthy spine. Here's another recent article, 2020, Journal of Biomechanics, and a systematic review of systematic reviews. I love that. That's so meta. So, so we're looking at a study that summarized all the studies of studies about low back pain. So basically we're trying to come up with, it's almost like we're trying to come up with guidelines, really. And we're trying to look at why the hell do people have low back pain? And essentially the big underwhelming conclusion here was there's no consensus of what causes low back pain. So there's a lot of theories, and some of them involve spinal flexion. Oh, spinal flexion is bad. It creates all these shearing forces in the spine, rotary forces of the spine, tears the annulus, that kind of stuff. Maybe not. Maybe for some people and not for other people. We just don't know right now. And so if somebody tries to give you a clear-cut answer on what causes low back pain, they're guessing. There are some theories that are better than others, but frankly, nobody can agree on it, is the point. When you get all the leading experts and you summarize the research, we just don't know. Here's a study from Brett Contreras, and he is looking at, should we be doing crunches, right? Should we be doing exercises, loaded exercises, essentially, where you are, encouraging spinal flexion, repeated spinal flexion. If spinal flexion is bad, then repeated spinal flexion under load should be especially bad, right? Well, actually, again, this is another study where we found that, well, there actually might be some benefits of the health of the spine, health of the discs, that actually repeated spinal flexion might actually be good for the spine. So another one that contradicts the idea that spinal flexion is bad. And lastly, here's an article from 2010, and they were looking at, so they used Army soldiers and during training, and they basically split them up into two groups. One of them did a bunch of sit-ups during, I think it was 16 weeks. Yeah, 16 weeks of training. And the other group did not do any sit-ups during that training period. And you would expect that if doing a bunch of sit-ups would cause low back pain, that in the group who over 16 weeks, which is a fair amount of time, that over 16 weeks doing a bunch of sit-ups, you would have more people in that group who did sit-ups have low back pain, right? That wasn't the case. So there wasn't really a big difference between groups. And so doing the sit-ups did not necessarily cause pain. However, here's a little caveat. There was marginal evidence that the group who didn't do the sit-ups had a little bit less time off of work because of low back injuries. So there might actually have been a little bit less disability in the group who didn't do the sit-ups. So in general, it wasn't a big deal, but there was some evidence, not strong enough for them to make a strong conclusion here in this article, but maybe pointing to the idea that there might be some difference there between sit-ups and no sit-ups in favor of doing no sit-ups. So man, how do you do that? How do you deal with all the conflicting information where you have statements like this in research where you have on one hand, it's not a big deal, but maybe it kind of is. That's really frustrating. And in this video, I didn't bring up any articles that are making a strong argument against doing spinal flexion, against doing sit-ups, right? And there are plenty of articles that suggest that. My point in this video was just to show you that there is a lot of good reason to think that at least exploring spinal flexion to some degree in your physical activity is probably a great idea. Now, I don't know about doing Jefferson curls. I don't know about picking up really, really heavy weight in spinal flexion. We do know that the spine is going to be stronger in a neutral position, but again, then you would look at Olympic lifters and things like that, and do they have a rounded spine? And yeah, they do. Or strong men, they tend to have a rounded spine, but they're super strong. And does that cause pain? Maybe not. It's very difficult. It just is confusing. If you're confused, guess what? So is everybody else. So are the leading experts in the field, right? They're all arguing about it too at conferences. So if you're confused, so is everybody else. My takeaway would be this. If you're going to do any kind of spinal flexion, first of all, do spinal flexion. Do things like cat-cow, do spinal waves, do use your spine in its full range of motion every day. However, don't force it. Don't start picking up really heavy weights right away in spinal flexion. Don't all of a sudden start doing a ton of exercise in spinal flexion because you think it's not a problem. Because we need to apply general strength and conditioning principles like progressive overload. If you're going to ease your way into spinal flexion, which I recommend that you do a little bit of, at least, then do it slowly. Get used to it. Give yourself weeks to adapt and then add a little bit more. Add like 10% difficulty and then give yourself a couple weeks. Get used to it. Make sure it feels okay in your body. Then add 10% more in difficulty, right? And then you can work your way up to some really difficult things even with a rounded spine and have it be perfectly safe, right? So that would be the main takeaway, I think, is just to have a little bit of a balanced perspective. It's not dangerous. It is clearly not. There are plenty of studies looking at, does a rounded spine lead to more low back pain? And it does not look that way. It doesn't appear that low back pain is more likely if you flex your spine on a regular basis. In fact, sometimes it might actually be beneficial to the health of the discs if you do adapt to a rounded spine position. So do a little bit in every direction, use all of your joints in every direction they can go, and health, here's your real takeaway. Health, or here's your like Instagram, here's a little quote for you, is that the health of a joint is not determined by static posture, but rather by the ability to move. Okay? So there's your takeaway. Move your body every day. Peace.